She destroyed enemy hide with the training of her legendary sniper father. This story begins in the mountains of Afghanistan, where Sergeant First Class Maria Phantom Rodriguez was staring at an enemy position that had already killed 17 American soldiers. At 26 years old, Maria was the youngest sniper in her Special Operations Unit, but she carried knowledge that could turn the tide of the entire operation if she could find the courage to use it. But even her extensive military training hadn't prepared her for the impossible task ahead. "Rodriguez, that bunker complex has been bleeding us dry for 3 days," said Colonel James Thunder Mitchell, pointing toward the fortified enemy position carved into the mountainside. "Our best demolition experts can't get close enough. Artillery can't penetrate the rock face. Even our Apache helicopters can't find an angle that works." Maria studied the enemy hide through her high-powered scope, analyzing the sophisticated defensive position that had been constructed with deadly precision. The Taliban fighters had built their stronghold into natural rock formations, creating overlapping fields of fire that made conventional assault impossible. "Sir," Maria said carefully, "what about precision targeting? If we could identify structural weak points—" Major Sarah Steele Peterson interrupted with obvious skepticism. "Rodriguez, this isn't a standard sniper mission. We need that entire complex neutralized, not picked apart one target at a time. You're a marksman, not a demolitions expert." The other soldiers nodded in agreement. Maria had proven herself as an accurate sniper, but destroying hardened enemy positions required specialized knowledge that nobody expected her to possess. What they didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez wasn't just another talented marksman. She was the daughter of Master Sergeant Carlos "Ghost" Rodriguez, the legendary sniper who had revolutionized battlefield destruction techniques during the Iraq War and whose methods were still classified at the highest levels of military intelligence. Maria Phantom Rodriguez carried a secret that could have changed how her entire unit approached impossible missions. Her father, Carlos "Ghost" Rodriguez, hadn't just been a legendary sniper. He'd been the military's leading expert in what the Pentagon called precision demolition, the art of destroying enemy fortifications using carefully placed sniper shots rather than conventional explosives. Carlos had developed his techniques during 3 tours in Iraq, where he'd learned to analyze enemy positions with an engineer's eye for structural weakness and a sniper's precision for targeting critical points. His methods had allowed small teams to neutralize enemy strongholds without risking the lives of assault troops or expending massive amounts of ammunition. But Carlos's techniques had died with him when he was killed by an IED 6 years ago. The Pentagon had classified his methods, and his training manuals had been locked away in military archives that most soldiers would never access. The only person who knew his secrets was Maria, who had spent her teenage years learning not just marksmanship from her father, but structural analysis, ballistics physics, and the complex mathematics of battlefield demolition. "Mia," Carlos had told her during their last training session before his final deployment, "shooting isn't just about hitting targets. It's about understanding what happens after your bullet hits. Every structure has weak points, every defense has vulnerabilities, but you have to think like an engineer, not just a shooter." Carlos had taught Maria to see enemy positions as 3-dimensional puzzles, where the right shot in the right place could trigger cascading failures that would bring down entire defensive complexes. But Maria had never told anyone about her father's specialized training, partly because she wanted to earn respect through her own achievements, and partly because she wasn't sure anyone would believe that a young female sniper could possess knowledge that the military's best demolition experts lacked. Now, staring at an enemy hide that conventional warfare couldn't touch, Maria realized she might be the only person in the entire theater of operations who knew how to solve this deadly puzzle. "Colonel," Maria said, studying the enemy complex through her scope with eyes that had been trained to see what others missed, "I might have an approach that could work." Colonel Mitchell looked at her with obvious doubt. "Rodriguez, we've had structural engineers analyze that position. There's no way to bring it down without heavy explosives, and we can't get close enough to place charges." Maria continued her analysis, using techniques her father had taught her during countless hours of training. Carlos had shown her how to identify load-bearing points, how to recognize structural stress concentrations, and how to calculate the exact placement needed to trigger catastrophic failures. "Sir, what if I told you that complex isn't as solid as it looks? The builders used natural rock formations, but they had to modify the stone to create firing ports and defensive positions. Every modification creates structural weakness." Major Peterson shook her head. "Rodriguez, you're a sniper, not an engineer. Rock doesn't collapse because you put a bullet through it." But Maria was seeing something her commanding officers couldn't. Her father's training had taught her to identify the critical junction points where man-made modifications intersected with natural stone formations. These transition zones were always the weakest parts of any defensive position because they represented compromises between structural integrity and tactical advantage. "Major, I'm not talking about shooting through rock. I'm talking about targeting the support structures they built to hold their firing positions. Look at the third level. See how they've carved out that machine gun nest? They had to remove supporting stone to create that angle of fire. The whole section is held up by those wooden braces they installed." Maria pointed to barely visible support beams that were holding up an overhanging rock shelf. "If I can take out those supports in the right sequence, that entire section will collapse. And if that happens, it'll destabilize the levels above it." Colonel Mitchell studied the position through his own binoculars. "Rodriguez, even if you're right about structural weakness, you're talking about precision shots at extreme range while under enemy fire. The margin for error would be microscopic." Maria felt her father's presence like a whisper in the wind. "Sir, my father always said that the hardest shots aren't about distance or wind conditions. They're about understanding what you're really trying to accomplish. I'm not just trying to hit wooden beams. I'm trying to solve a physics problem." Maria set up her shooting position on a ridge 800 meters from the enemy complex, far enough to avoid direct fire, but close enough for the surgical precision her father's techniques required. Her M24 rifle was equipped with a high magnification scope, but the real tools she needed were the analytical skills Carlos had drilled into her during years of training. Through her scope, Maria began the complex process her father had taught her: structural mapping. She identified every support beam, every load-bearing point, every junction where human modification met natural stone. Most importantly, she calculated the sequence of shots needed to create a cascading failure. "This is Phantom," Maria radioed to her commanding officers. "I've identified 7 critical support points. If I take them out in the right order, the collapse will propagate upward and neutralize the entire complex." "Rodriguez, this is Thunder," Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Are you certain about this approach? Once you start shooting, they'll know exactly where you are. You'll have maybe 30 seconds before they turn every weapon in that complex toward your position." Maria thought about her father's final lesson, delivered the night before his last patrol. "Mia, when everything depends on precision, you don't think about the danger. You think about the physics, trust the mathematics, and the mathematics will take care of everything else." "Colonel, I need exactly 27 seconds to complete the sequence. After that, physics takes over." Maria took a deep breath and began the most complex shooting sequence of her military career. Her first shot targeted a wooden support beam on the complex's third level, a piece of timber barely 6 inches wide at 800 meters distance. The bullet struck precisely where her calculations indicated, severing the beam and immediately causing the stone shelf above it to sag. Enemy fighters began firing in her direction, but Maria was already shifting to her second target. Shot 2. Another support beam, this one holding up a different section of the same level. The stone groaned audibly as stress redistributed through the modified rock face. Shot 3. A critical junction point where Taliban engineers had installed metal reinforcement. Maria's bullet struck the welded joint with perfect accuracy, sending stress fractures racing through the surrounding stone. "Phantom, you've got heavy fire incoming." Major Peterson's voice was urgent. "Multiple shooters have you ranged." But Maria was in a zone her father had taught her to access, a state of mathematical calm where bullet trajectories became geometry problems and structural failures became physics equations. Shot 4. The load-bearing beam that was now supporting the weight from the collapsed sections above. Maria's bullet cut through it like a scalpel, and the domino effect her father had taught her to create began in earnest. The cascade failure that followed Maria's precision sequence unfolded exactly as her father's training had predicted. Stone sections that had been modified by enemy engineers began collapsing in a carefully orchestrated symphony of structural physics. Level 3 collapsed first, sending tons of rock crashing down onto Level 2. The impact created stress fractures that propagated upward, weakening the supports for Level 4. Within 15 seconds of Maria's final shot, the entire left side of the enemy complex was collapsing in a controlled demolition that would have impressed professional engineers. But Maria wasn't finished. Her father had taught her that successful demolition required follow-up precision to ensure complete neutralization. Shots 5, 6, and 7 targeted the remaining structural points that were still holding up the right side of the complex. Each bullet was placed with mathematical precision, cutting through support elements that enemy fighters didn't even realize were critical to their position's integrity. The final collapse was spectacular and complete. What had been an impregnable enemy stronghold 30 seconds earlier became a pile of rubble that posed no threat to anyone. More importantly, the precision of Maria's technique had neutralized the position without causing the kind of explosive destruction that could have triggered rock slides endangering American forces below. Jesus Christ! Colonel Mitchell's voice came through Maria's earpiece, filled with disbelief. Rodriguez, that was impossible. How did you know where to shoot? Maria began packing up her rifle, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. My father taught me, sir. He always said that every defensive position is just a structural engineering problem waiting for the right solution. Your father was an engineer? Maria smiled, thinking of Carlos and the countless hours he'd spent teaching her to see battlefields as three-dimensional puzzles. My father was Master Sergeant Carlos Ghost Rodriguez, sir. He developed precision demolition techniques during the Iraq War. The silence on the radio channel was deafening. Every operator in the unit knew the name Ghost Rodriguez. His legend had grown in the 6 years since his death, and his classified techniques were still studied at the highest levels of Special Operations Command. Carlos Rodriguez was your father? Major Peterson's voice carried a mixture of shock and sudden understanding. That explains everything. Ghost was the only operator who could neutralize hardened positions with nothing but a rifle and mathematical precision. He taught me everything he knew, ma'am, not because he wanted me to become a soldier, but because he wanted me to understand that there's always a solution to every problem if you're willing to see it from the right angle. As Maria made her way back to the forward operating base, she received a radio message that would change her understanding of everything her father had tried to teach her. Phantom, this is Thunder. I've got someone here who wants to talk to you. The voice that came through her earpiece was unfamiliar but carried obvious authority. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is General Patricia Hayes, Special Operations Command. I worked with your father during his development of precision demolition techniques. Maria felt her chest tighten. General Hayes was a legend in special operations circles, the officer who had overseen the most classified tactical innovations of the past decade. General Hayes, ma'am. It's an honor. Sergeant, what you just accomplished wasn't just impressive field work. You executed techniques that we thought had died with your father. The Pentagon has been trying to reverse engineer Ghost's methods for years, but we never had anyone who truly understood the underlying principles. Maria found a secure location and keyed her radio. Ma'am, my father spent years teaching me to think like an engineer. He said that shooting was just mathematics made visible. Your father was right, but more than that, he was protecting something incredibly valuable. The techniques you just used represent a revolutionary approach to battlefield problem solving. Instead of overwhelming enemy positions with firepower, you solve them with precision and understanding. General Hayes paused, and Maria could hear background conversation that suggested important people were listening to this conversation. Sergeant Rodriguez, the Pentagon wants to offer you a position with our Advanced Tactical Development Program. Your father's techniques could save thousands of lives if we can train other operators to see battlefields the way you do. Maria thought about her father's final words to her. Mija, I'm not teaching you these things because I want you to fight wars. I'm teaching them to you because someday you might be the person who helps end them. General, I'm honored by the offer, but I think my father would want me to stay in the field, using these techniques where they can do the most good for the soldiers who need them most. I understand, Sergeant, but would you be willing to train other operators, to pass on what your father taught you? Maria looked back toward the mountain, where an impossible enemy position had been neutralized not through destruction, but through understanding. She thought about the 17 soldiers who had died before she'd found the courage to use her father's techniques, and about all the soldiers who might live if those techniques could be taught to others. Yes, ma'am, I think that's exactly what my father would want. 6 months later, Sergeant First Class Maria Phantom Rodriguez was conducting the first official training course in precision demolition techniques at the Special Operations Training Center. But more than teaching marksmanship, she was teaching soldiers to think like engineers, to see enemy positions as problems to be solved rather than obstacles to be overwhelmed. Her students called the course Ghost Protocols in honor of the legendary sniper who had developed the techniques that were revolutionizing special operations warfare. But Maria always began each class with the lesson her father had considered most important. Precision isn't about being the best shooter, she would tell new students, echoing Carlos's words from years of training sessions. Precision is about understanding what you're really trying to accomplish. When you understand the physics, when you see the mathematics, when you recognize the engineering, then every impossible problem becomes a solvable equation. The techniques Carlos Ghost Rodriguez had developed were finally being shared with the operators who needed them most. But perhaps more importantly, his philosophy was being passed on, that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield isn't firepower or technology, but the trained mind that can see solutions where others see only problems. Maria kept her father's original training notes in her office, along with a photo of the two of them at their private range, where a teenager had learned that warfare could be an expression of applied physics. But what she treasured most was a handwritten note Carlos had left for her, found among his personal effects after his death. Mija, if you're reading this, it means you found a way to use what I taught you. Remember that these techniques aren't about destruction, they're about precision. They're about solving problems with the minimum force necessary. They're about bringing soldiers home alive. That's the real victory. Love, Papa. Maria Rodriguez went on to train hundreds of special operations personnel in her father's techniques, but she never forgot the most important lesson Carlos had taught her: that legendary skills aren't inherited through genetics. They're passed on through patient teaching and the faith that someone you love can become everything they're meant to be. Type precision if you believe that the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from perfect understanding, and that the most powerful legacy a parent can leave is teaching their child to see solutions where others see only problems.